Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and as always, I'm here with Paul. And Paul, what a fascinating statement President Vladimir Putin said yesterday, or actually today, Wednesday, with RT. I will meet with Donald with pleasure. And I think we have to really take a look at the meeting that U.S. and Russian officials had over the weekend or last week in Saudi Arabia, how significant it was and what it's going to mean for future relations, not just between Russia and the United States, but perhaps for global relations with the U.S. going forward. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this because things appear to be changing.
Well, thanks as well, Ken, obviously, for joining me today. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overblow the sentiment and get carried away because this is just the first step in a very long journey that will might happen a lot quicker than we can expect. It might never happen. It might take longer than people's expectations are, but crucially, it is the first step, and it may be something we will look back historically in the coming year and into the future, where it was a huge watershed change, not only in US Russian relations, but in a broader sense. The US actually recognizing what Rubio said a few weeks ago, which was basically it's the end of the unipolar world and we're returning to multipolarity. And this could be the first step in the US going, we're not an hegemonic power anymore, but we can be a great nation amongst equals and we can work constructively and positively with Russia. And this will be hugely beneficial to both of us. And frankly, if Europe at this point spitting blood about it, that's their problem. We don't care. We're not interested. And so effectively, this meeting in Riyadh was a way of just re-establishing contact in a direct way, not an informal way. Yes, there's been back channels open throughout the whole of the Ukraine war, but this is something on a entirely different level and not something we've seen for many, many years, many decades, arguably. And in essence, it was a chance to say, okay, can we move forward in terms of finding a resolution on Ukraine? Is there a way that we can set the scene for Trump and Putin to have a meeting, the first meeting? And, is the common ground? Can we get over the ideological problems that, particularly from the West perspective, from the US, and find common ground and realize that we can just discuss things objectively and behave like mature adults. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to think about having two nations of this stature doing so, but that was really the basis of the conversation. Now, it lasted 4.5 hours. The general consensus, and we'll break it down in a bit of detail in a minute, was everything was very positive, was constructive. It certainly is the springboard for Trump and Putin to meet at some point, maybe in the next month, maybe a bit sooner. And also, of course, they didn't discuss in any detail Ukraine. That comes further down the line. This was more on a bilateral basis and discussing, their perspectives on geopolitical issues and economic issues, financial issues, and just generally saying, look, is there a way forward for us? Because both sides now want this. Trump wants it, the United States wants it, Russia wants it for sure. This was all initiated by the Americans because Putin made the point, I'm not really interested in some half-baked nonsense anymore. I got, basically he was totally misled with regards to Minsk and the Minsk agreements, which we know were just instigated by Ukraine time to fortify and arm itself for whatever future conflict, whether it was because Russia would be an aggressor directly or because something that would subsequently not be initiated per se by the Ukrainians or by the West on because obviously Ukraine's a proxy, but actually to have a situation where for the first time probably in Trump Putin's entire presidency going back 25 years that we can now find a way forward. Now, as I say, don't get carried away by this. Don't assume that this is a path of no resistance, that it is likely to have resistance. It may not achieve its objectives, but we actually really have to hope it does, because without a doubt, if it does, it will be one of the most incredible developments, from my perspective, that's ever happened in geopolitics. And it could usher in whatever Trump meant by the golden age, where everyone just gets along. We forget all the past, and realize that win-win cooperation is the future, and we can make the planet a great place for everyone. That may seem idealistic, it may seem impossible, but it can be achieved. It's not that complicated. It's a lot easier than people would necessarily think, but it has to start with basic brutal honesty between the two sides, and to say, look, this is what our interests are, and this is what our objectives are. These are the things we're not happy about. These are the things we feel need to be addressed in bilateral terms. And then you can extend that to the issue of Ukraine and other geopolitical hotspots, including, of course, obviously West Asia as one example.
I think there's a few points. You may have talked about this on your subscription podcast, and I think we may have touched upon a couple last week. But some of the key ones were Russia and U.S. have agreed to restore the staff of embassies in Moscow and Washington. Normalization of relations, that I think was a key important one. A proposal for the ceasefire in the conflict. Now, this is like you mentioned, this is not going to happen overnight. And even Putin to RT yesterday said it was something like, this is going to be 6 months, it's not going to be in days, it's going to be in a few months down the road as things go. And the more that Russia continues its successes in Ukraine currently, the quicker and easier it's going to get to find some type of resolution. There was the talks of elections, both recognizing that the current leader of Ukraine is in more of a role of a dictator, suppressing the democratic and constitutional laws of their country. But here's one that stands out too. U.S. companies to return back to Russia with an emphasis placed on U.S. oil companies working with Gazprom. To me, more than that, what it says is that the Trump administration is very amenable, obviously, to reconnecting Russia with SWIFT and to remove many of the sanctions that were currently on there. So if that happens, imagine what it's going to do. You're going to see, obviously, Europe in its current state, the leaders just going apoplectic. But it's also going to show the rest of the world that, hey, you know what? If we want you to continue using the dollar, we're going to do everything in our capacity to make it, easier, and it's not going to be used as a weaponized function that it has under the previous administrations.
Yeah, let's go through the points. I mean, because they're extremely important, as you said, Ken. Now, Ursakov, who's obviously Putin's presidential aide, he said, basically came out of the meeting and went, look, we discussed everything on the agenda, including, the position of bilateral relations and how we can bring Russia and the United States together. They want to form, obviously, a contact group for Ukraine, because that is part of the negotiations. Lavrov said everything was very constructive. As you rightly said, Ken, they want to restore proper diplomatic relations between the two countries, including ambassadors returning to New York and Moscow. It's interesting that the State Department said that both Lavrov and Rubio agreed on creating negotiating terms on Ukraine, as well as future cooperation on shared geopolitical interests, because that's basically financial stuff's not really Lavrov and Rubio's remit, obviously. But they both said the negotiations went well, that all topics that were covered, discussing and appreciating each other's national interests. You're absolutely right about normalization of relations, and it's just Ukraine's only a small part of that. It's not in any way, shape, or form the be and end all of it. With regards to talk of elections in Ukraine, and we'll discuss Ukraine separately with regards to Zelensky and what's going on. It's interesting because the United States wants democratic elections. It wants the Ukrainian people to decide on a future leader. The United States clearly wants Zelensky gone, and so that's for an entirely separate podcast. But the reason is they want it done democratically. Now, there'll be people who go, well, can't they just have some sort of color revolution and get rid of him? Absolutely not. First of all, that's crassly irresponsible. And B, when there's a war going on, absolutely not. And also, if it's found out to be the case, it'll be easily proven, then Trump's in serious hot water. His administration is going to look worse than incompetent, reckless, etc., and it could cause huge problems for Trump in the process. So I don't think they're even remotely thinking that, but I think the thinking is, well, we have to some way restore a democracy inside Ukraine, which doesn't exist. And Trump said stuff like he's a dictator and he's overstayed his welcome, etc. And his approval ratings 4%. I'm not sure it's that low, but it is very low. So that absolutely illustrates both nations, I think, want elections also, so then a successor can then dot the I's across the T's and sign an agreement between the Russians and the Ukrainians. With regards to this ceasefire, the US wants the conflict over as soon as possible. Russia does too, but there's not going to be a ceasefire, because a ceasefire then means it might start again. It's a frozen conflict. The war ends on the basis that there's a comprehensive agreement that ends the war in totality, not something that they could come back in the future and a war starts all over again in a matter of weeks or months. You're absolutely right, Ken, talking about US oil companies returning to Russia to work with Gazprom. Russia's sovereign wealth fund also made points about this, about US companies returning. But the problem is, and it's going to be the case for all Western companies, because of the sanctions, Russia, obviously, companies left. Russia companies came and filled the void. They've now continued to fill the void. They're successful. So it's going to be tough for US companies to get a toehold or a foothold back in Russia, but they're welcome to try. But it might not be as simple as just because you can't roll over domestic Russian companies and say, sorry, you're going to have to move out because America's back. It's just not going to wash. But it's absolutely true. US companies lost hundreds of billions of dollars leaving Russia because they had to obviously incur write-downs, loss of revenue, and basically selling assets for cents on the dollar. But it makes absolute sense for US corporations to try and move back into Russia, and also for oil and also for gas companies for that matter. But what's very clear is the fact that the US has come out and made statements that Ukraine caused this war, Ukraine was responsible. And the Russians finally think someone's listening to them and saying, well, you understand why the war happened. You understand our perspective. You understand why you want Ukraine to be neutral, not in NATO, which the US has made statements to the effect that they agree with that. And that's their perspective. Okay, these are early days and maybe sentiment and statements will change. But there was no statement on Ukraine and the EU participating in any future meeting. I mean, and the belief is, well, if the Russians think they should be there, they can be there. I could see Ukraine being in the future, clearly. At the moment, I just don't see the EU being there because they're going to be totally obstructive and be of no value whatsoever to the meeting. They won't offer anything that is of any use because the only way to move forward is to let go of ideological hatred for whatever reason that might be, whether you were a member of the former Soviet bloc, be it in the Baltic republics, for example. You've just got to let go and realize the future isn't the past. It's not going to be the same. But fundamentally, this is the most positive thing I think we've seen with respect to Russia and the United States since maybe the Gorbachev, though of course that was a bit of a false dawn, Reagan era, where there was some belief that there could have been a change. There was also a belief that once the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War was over, and it should have been. Of course, it wasn't. The US decided to have further enlargement of NATO after agreeing not to, and that's definitively the case. I know people still say it's not true, but it is. And that's why you have to be cautiously optimistic about this, because it really would be a true watershed moment, but there is a long way to go. But you could certainly see the United States broadly just agreeing with Russia's position on ending the war. It's absolutely clear Trump has come out and said Russia holds the cards. Well, of course they do, because they're winning the war. I hate to use the word victor because no one wins a war ultimately, but they are winning it in the sense that they get to dictate the terms to end the war. Otherwise, it will carry on in perpetuity, almost until there is an agreement that says we have to end this war. So the US wants it to end, Russia wants it to end, and Europe and Ukraine don't want it to end on the terms that it is going to end, because they then fear what the future is going to be. But I say we'll discuss that separately. So I think it's a good starting point. It's probably gone as well as we can expect. I'm very encouraged by the level of maturity the United States is showing. I have to say, and we'll have to see as things progress, but I'm very pleasantly surprised by the maturity that Rubio is showing with regards to Russia. We'll have to see how that pans out with other regions of the world and what he comes out. But there is a real maturity to this, and Witkoff is showing himself to be a diplomat that just gets things done, wants to get on with things. And he, apparently he basically told Netanyahu, you're going to meet me. Netanyahu didn't want to. He says, I'm turning up. You're going to meet me. That's it. And we're going to have a ceasefire with respect to Gaza. And there's no dispute about this. There's no discussion. It's happening. And it happened. So we have to be cautiously optimistic that there are people who are going to join any team with regards to discussing Ukraine, and that they can find common ground to end the war. I think there might be some things that will pleasantly surprise people, may also shock people, because I think with regards to economic and ways forward, we might find there's a lot of cooperation with regards to Ukraine itself, because, well, certainly not just the part of Ukraine, Russia will obviously be part of the Russian Federation in the future, but also parts of Ukraine itself. It might be a situation where there'll be a lot of economic cooperation between the two nations to help develop assets or whatever they actually are in Ukraine, because now that's entirely up in the air, and that's we'll discuss in another podcast also.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting you mentioned, the potential of what's going on now with Gorbachev. I almost see it back in the late 50s with Khrushchev. When Khrushchev came to the U.S., did a tour. I remember a story that he spent a lot of time on a farm with I think it was in Iowa. And even though in 1960 uh, the relations fell apart after the U-2 spy plane incident, even when Khrushchev was out of office and no longer the premier, he ended up staying in communication with that farmer. They became, friends for the rest of both their lives. So the reality is that there's much about Russia, and if you look historically, Russia was involved in on our side in regards to the Civil War. Russia was involved in stopping Napoleon. Russia was involved in saving Europe from the Mongols. So Russia has, strong allegiances especially because of their Orthodox Christian, background to want to be part of the West and to want to be in good relations. Now, when it comes to U.S. oil companies working with Gazprom, just my thoughts and speculation, but it's not necessarily working in Russia itself. But can you imagine them working together in the Arctic to try to develop the Arctic, make pipelines, et cetera, et cetera? Because what is Trump's real goal? Trump's real goal is to get energy prices down, period. It's almost like he doesn't really care where it comes from. And then lastly, when it comes to Ukraine, the discussions between the two, I think you know Trump realizes that there's going to have to be some concessions, just like Putin does. And if Putin can trust that if there are, say, this is just speculation, European peacekeepers, U.S. peacekeepers, and that they won't be used for nefarious purposes in trying to, instigate the war. Well, what is something that Trump has proposed? He's proposed pulling out a lot of U.S. troops from Europe as a whole. He's even proposed cutting, military spending for all three countries in half. So you're looking at just as you mentioned, the U.S. no longer wanting to be this hegemonic power that controls and dominates everything, but instead wants to pull back and focus on the nationality of the U.S., just like Putin is wanting to build Russia and, as a nationalist, not as an empire. So the potential's there. We'll have to see going in the future. Paul, was there any other comments that you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, it's worth mentioning. You make a good point about peacekeepers because the US has categorically stated they're not having any US forces there. And Putin's attitude to that is I don't want NATO forces there under the umbrella of the European Union either. Now, he may change his mind. I have a feeling he won't. But then the argument is, well, you could have, and there's been suggestions that the US has approached China about having peacekeeping forces. You could have Brazil's been mentioned. You could have African countries. You could have West Asian countries, Southeast Asia. They don't have to be necessarily in any way, shape, or form from those countries. And frankly, I don't think the United States would be particularly happy about having European peacekeeping forces there, given they may overextend themselves. They may do something stupid and reckless. And because the US now doesn't trust the European NATO countries to behave responsibly, they think they're acting irrationally. So I think that's an important point to make in that regard. And I think the other point worth making, we were going to say before we came on, Ken, was the issue of China and how this relates to this, because there's been this long held belief, and there was kind of statements at one time in the first administration where there was this idea that Trump wanted to drive a wedge between China and Russia, hence get Russia on board, sweet talk them a bit, and then decapitate China, which of course is nonsense and will never happen. And then once China's weakened, multipolarity is dead, and then they'll decapitate Russia. Well, these are not even sensible suggestions, but there has been recent noises coming out from the US regarding wanting to have a more substantive trade agreement with the Chinese, to have significant Chinese investment in the United States, which is something said to Trump administration in 2016. This is how you need to treat them. You need to reproach them with Russia. Okay, none of this ever happened. And to have this relationship with China. They're also I don't sure Beijing will agree to this to have some sort of arms control deal with the Chinese. Maybe it's just goodwill, good sentiment. Maybe they can agree on this, but okay, this might be pie in the sky, might not ever materialize, but there are enough encouraging noises at this stage to suggest that's a possibility. We may see it come to fruition. And that, again, is another element of this golden age, because if the United States can make up, kiss and make up with the Russians, moderate their attitude with the Chinese, then actually bury the hatchet with the Iranians, then it will be the greatest developments that have ever happened by any nation in my lifetime. And, you would truly say the United States was then, and if it's genuine, I mean, not just, kind of paying lip service, they genuinely resolved their differences with those three nations, then the US will have returned to being a great nation amongst equals. And let's hope that happens, because that then really would truly be a golden age, as if that's what Trump's alluding to. We don't know whether he means that or not, but I have a feeling that's what he's alluding to.
Absolutely. And you know, politicians say a lot of things to get elected. Sometimes you got to appease one group, and that's not. But I think over the time, just in the short amount of time, whether it was leading up to the inauguration and now into that, I think the realization that you cannot browbeat the powers like Russia, China, maybe even India, some of Africa. You can't just simply beat them into submission. If Trump really wants the United States to succeed, the dollar to still be used, I think he sees that the more you sanction, the more you force other nations into not using the dollar, the quicker the downfall of the U.S. and its economic power is going to decline. So what do? You do the exact opposite. You get them to invest in your country, you invest in theirs, and that, of course, is a joint thing. And we saw bits of it. It wasn't, obviously it was when Trump early on said, hey, you know what? We need to get with China and make a G2. That was, I think, just the first little inclinations that Trump is recognizing that, you know what, we can no longer afford to simply be this shining beacon on the hill, and the entire world bows to our whims and commands, but instead chipping away at how can we work with the economic and military powers of the world to try to make the world a better place. So we shall see in the coming days. Paul, as always, thank you for your insight and for being a part of this discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Cirrus Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.